Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Great. Today we're heading to Amsterdam, a city that, well, let's just say it has a unique relationship with water.
That's one way to put it. I mean, imagine building a major city on land that's basically a marsh.
Yeah, and not just any city. Amsterdam, during its golden age in the 17th century, was a global powerhouse.
It really was. And when you look at those iconic canals, especially the Harengracht, also known as the Golden Bend, it's hard not to be impressed by the sheer scale of what they achieved.
And the engineering involved, right? I mean, dredging those canals, piling up all that mud and sand to create the banks, then laying brick roads, and on top of all that, driving thousands of wooden logs into the soggy ground to support the weight of those massive houses.
They really were masters of water management, those 17th century Dutch. That skill was absolutely essential to Amsterdam's rise. And speaking of the Harengracht, we can't talk about it without mentioning Andries de Graaf.
One of Amsterdam's most prominent mayors.
Exactly. And his house on the Harengracht really embodies both the wealth and the more understated values of the Dutch Golden Age.
From the sources I read, it sounds like it was a grand house with an impressive coat of arms and the motto, "Death makes scepters and hoes equal."
A good reminder that even amidst all that wealth, there was a strong sense of, I guess you could call it egalitarianism in Dutch society.
Interesting. So even though the Dutch were incredibly prosperous, they weren't as, well, how do I put this, flashy as some other European elites.
Exactly. Andries de Graaf's house, for all its luxury, wasn't anything like the palaces you'd see in other parts of Europe. It reflected this idea of civic virtue, that service to the community was more important than just showing off your wealth.
That's fascinating. And this emphasis on community and shared values seems to have extended even to the art world. I know de Graaf was a big art collector, and he owned quite a few paintings by Rembrandt, who was probably the most famous Dutch painter of the Golden Age.
Oh, absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting. Rembrandt, despite being known for his incredibly detailed paintings of everyday life in Amsterdam, he seemed to intentionally avoid depicting the newly developed parts of the city.
Almost like he was making a statement.
It's possible. Some scholars think that his focus on the older parts of Amsterdam might have been a subtle way of pushing back against the rapid changes the city was going through. Kind of a way of preserving the city's past, even as it was being transformed by commerce and expansion.
I see. So it wasn't just about portraying the wealth and grandeur of the Golden Age, but also about capturing something deeper, something essential about Amsterdam.
Right. And that brings us to the political landscape of the 17th century. It was just as dynamic and unpredictable as the city itself. You had this constant tension between the powerful city councils and the stadtholder.
Kind of like a Lord Protector, right?
Exactly. And right in the thick of it were the de Graaf brothers. They were sharp political operators, and the way they outsmarted stadtholder William II in 1650 really shows how much influence they had in Amsterdam.
But of course, politics is a fickle game.
Yep.
William II died suddenly from smallpox, and that really shook things up for the de Graafs. And then came 1672, the ramp jar, the disaster year.
When Louis XIV of France invaded, and everything went sideways.
The ramp jar really was a turning point for the Dutch. It marked the end of their golden age and the beginning of a period of political and economic instability.
It's pretty incredible that Andries de Graaf, even with all that turmoil, held on to his wealth and his position in Amsterdam.
Shows you how resilient both the man and the city were. Speaking of resilience, let's move on to Dam Square, the heart of Amsterdam and the amazing building that started out as Amsterdam's town hall.
The town hall was truly a symbol of civic pride for Amsterdam. A massive building. It needed something like 13,000 wooden piles just to hold it up.
Wow, that's even more than the de Graaf house.
It is. And it wasn't just the size that was impressive. It was decorated with these elaborate murals depicting scenes from classical history, stories from the Bible, and, Dutch patriotic narratives.
It's almost like they were trying to link Amsterdam to these ancient civilizations, drawing parallels to biblical stories.
They definitely had a sense of their own importance on the world stage. And it wasn't just the Dutch who felt that way. I came across this account from an Englishman who was clearly envious of the Dutch Republic's success. He compared Amsterdam to ancient Greek republics, even to great monarchies.
High praise indeed. But of course, history is full of twists and turns. In 1806, the political winds shifted again. Napoleon's brother, Louis Bonaparte, became King of Holland.
And the former town hall, well, it got a promotion. It became the Royal Palace. Quite a change for Amsterdam, going from a republic to a monarchy, even if it was under French rule.
It's fascinating how a building meant to represent Republican ideals suddenly became the home of a king. And even in this transition, there are these moments that remind us that history is made by real people.
Oh, absolutely. Like that story about Lou Bonaparte trying to learn Dutch and accidentally calling himself Conan, the Dutch word for rabbit, instead of koning, which means king.
Those little human moments really make history come alive. Now let's shift our focus to another group that played a huge role in shaping Amsterdam's character, the Jewish community. Their story in Amsterdam is a blend of integration and, sadly, tragedy.
Their story really offers a unique perspective on Amsterdam's evolution. The Jewish community in Amsterdam goes back to the 17th century when Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution in Spain and Portugal found a safe haven in the city.
It's quite a contrast when you think about it, the open and tolerant environment they found in Amsterdam compared to the horrors of the Inquisition they were running from.
Amsterdam truly was a beacon of hope for those seeking refuge. And a perfect example of that tolerance is the Portuguese synagogue, built in 1675. It's a magnificent building with a huge barrel-vaulted ceiling, tons of candles lighting up the space, and even a sand-covered floor.
This wasn't a community hiding in fear. They were thriving, confident, and fully integrated into Amsterdam life.
The Portuguese synagogue really symbolizes the flourishing of Jewish life in Amsterdam. It was more than just a place of worship, it was a center of social and cultural life.
But as we all know, this period of peace and acceptance couldn't last forever. The shadow of World War II would soon engulf Europe, and Amsterdam's Jewish community would face unimaginable horrors under Nazi occupation.
A tragic and difficult chapter to grapple with, especially for a city with such a strong tradition of tolerance. It raises questions about how such a horrific thing could happen in a place known for its openness and acceptance.
And that's something we'll delve into deeper in part two. We'll explore how the Holocaust unfolded in Amsterdam, a city that had once been a haven for those fleeing persecution.
It really is a stark contrast, isn't it? A city known for tolerance becomes a place of such terrible persecution. And when we look at the sources, they point to this complex mix of things that led to the Holocaust in Amsterdam. One key factor was this thing called pillarization in Dutch society.
Pillarization. I have to admit, I haven't heard that term before. What exactly did it mean?
Well, it was this way of organizing Dutch society. Basically, you had these separate pillars, each representing a different religious or social group. Each pillar had its own institutions, schools, hospitals, newspapers, even political parties. The idea was that it would promote harmony, right? Different groups could coexist peacefully within their own separate spheres.
So it was meant to be a system of tolerance, but it sounds like it backfired in a way.
Yeah, that's the tragic irony. What might have worked well in peacetime ended up creating these divisions that the Nazis were able to exploit during the occupation. Because each pillar was so self-contained with its own records and everything, it made it easier for the Nazis to identify and target Jewish citizens.
So in a way, this system meant to protect different groups actually made them more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And from what I've read, the Netherlands also had these incredibly detailed and reliable identity cards, which didn't help.
That's right. The Dutch identity cards were so thorough, almost impossible to forge, which made it that much harder for Jewish people to escape identification. It's a tragic example of how something like bureaucratic efficiency in the wrong hands can become a tool of oppression.
A chilling thought. And according to the sources, the anti-Jewish measures in Amsterdam escalated gradually but relentlessly. It started with things like Jewish teachers and professors being dismissed from their jobs, then curfews restricting their movement.
And tragically, it culminated in the creation of the Jewish Council, the Judenraad, which was forced to carry out the Nazis' orders. Historians still debate the role of the Judenraad today, whether they were complicit in the deportation of Jews or if they were just trying to lessen the horrors as best they could in an impossible situation.
A complex and morally ambiguous situation, for sure. But even in this incredibly dark period, there were still glimmers of resistance. I read about the February strike of 1941, a general strike in Amsterdam protesting the persecution of Jews.
The February strike was really extraordinary. Workers across Amsterdam stopped working in solidarity with their Jewish neighbors. An incredible act of defiance, especially considering the risks they were taking.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always people willing to stand up against injustice, to fight for what's right. Sadly, though, the February strike didn't change the course of events. The deportations continued, and the Netherlands, despite its history of tolerance, ended up having one of the lowest Jewish survival rates of any Nazi-occupied country.
It's a heartbreaking statistic, a stark reminder of the devastating impact the Holocaust had on Amsterdam, a city that had once been a safe haven for those fleeing persecution.
And within this larger tragedy, there's the story of Anne Frank, a young girl whose diary has become a powerful symbol of the human cost of the Holocaust.
Anne Frank's story is both deeply personal and universal. Her diary gives us this incredibly intimate glimpse into the lives of people living under unimaginable circumstances, hiding, facing constant fear and uncertainty.
What strikes me is her optimism. Even in the midst of such darkness, she managed to find moments of joy and beauty.
That's what makes her diary so enduring. It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit can endure. Her words still resonate with people all over the world, reminding us how fragile freedom is and how important it is to fight against hatred and intolerance.
It's a powerful story, a testament to hope and resilience, but also a stark reminder of the dangers of inaction and indifference. It compels us to learn from the past and work towards a future where these horrors never happen again.
Anne Frank's diary is a call to action. It urges us to stand up against prejudice and discrimination, to remember the victims, and to work towards a world that's more just and compassionate.
But Amsterdam's story doesn't end with the Holocaust. The city emerged from the war, and in the post-war period, it went through another incredible transformation, becoming a global symbol of liberalism. It's amazing how Amsterdam was able to reinvent itself after World War II, especially after experiencing something as traumatic as the Holocaust. But becoming a symbol of liberalism, that seems like quite a shift for a city so steeped in tradition.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But Amsterdam has always had this, well, this pragmatic side to it. If you look back, you can see traces of this liberal tendency even centuries earlier. Think about how they were with religious minorities, groups like the Beguines and Mennonites. They practiced their faiths openly, even though they weren't part of the dominant Calvinist group.
So this embrace of liberal values after the war, it wasn't so much a break from the past, but more like a continuation of this live and let live attitude that had always been part of Amsterdam's DNA.
Exactly. Amsterdam's always been a city that pushes boundaries, challenges conventions. And after World War II, this took on a whole new dimension. Amsterdam was a leading force in the gay rights movement. In fact, the world's first gay rights organization was founded there in 1946.
And then, of course, the Netherlands became the first country to legalize same-sex marriage in 2000. It really seems like Amsterdam was at the forefront of this huge cultural shift.
Absolutely. And this liberal approach extended to other areas too. Think about Amsterdam's stance on drugs and prostitution. You have the famous coffee shops, the red light district. They definitely attracted a lot of attention, both positive and negative.
I can see how that would be controversial, even in a liberal society. Were those activities actually considered legal?
It's not so straightforward. It was more like this don't ask, don't tell approach. Not explicitly legal, but tolerated within certain limits. It's kind of interesting when you compare it to how they dealt with religious minorities in earlier centuries.
So this pragmatic tolerance has deep roots in Amsterdam. But as we talked about earlier, this approach to liberalism wasn't without its problems. What were some of the downsides?
Well, one big issue was the involvement of organized crime. The legal gray areas around things like the coffee shops and the red light district created opportunities for exploitation. Things like drug trafficking and human trafficking became a problem.
So the very freedom that Amsterdam championed ended up creating spaces where criminal elements could thrive. It's a reminder that even the best intentions can sometimes have unintended consequences.
That's a really important point. And this tension played out in another sensitive area, immigration and Islam. Amsterdam, like a lot of European cities, saw a wave of immigrants after the war, and many of them were Muslim. At first, there was a strong focus on integration, in line with the city's liberal ideals.
But as we talked about before, the events of 9/11 and the rise of Islamophobia globally created new anxieties. Did that change how people in Amsterdam thought about immigration and Islam?
Definitely. The Netherlands has a strong tradition of free speech, and you started to see more people openly criticizing Islam. Some argued that Islamic values were at odds with Dutch liberalism. It led to some heated debates about how far tolerance should go and the potential for clashes between cultures.
And tragically, this debate took a violent turn in some cases. The murder of Theo van Gogh, who made that controversial film about Islam, is a stark example. That must have been a deeply unsettling event for Amsterdam.
It was a horrific act, and it really highlighted how complex and even dangerous the intersection of free speech, religious sensitivities, and cultural integration can be. Even in a city as tolerant as Amsterdam, there are limits, and pushing those limits can have devastating consequences.
It seems like Amsterdam's journey through the 20th and 21st centuries has been all about finding that balance, embracing freedom and tolerance while also dealing with the challenges that come with those values. So where does that leave Amsterdam today? Has it pulled back from its liberal stance, or is it still searching for that equilibrium?
Amsterdam, like a lot of cities around the world, is taking a more cautious approach to liberalism these days. I think there's a greater awareness of the potential risks of unchecked freedom and a growing understanding that balancing individual liberty with social responsibility is a constant work in progress.
No easy answers there. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Amsterdam's transformation, what are the key takeaways we should leave our listeners with?
Amsterdam's story is really a testament to reinvention, the ability of a city and its people to adapt and evolve with the times. It's a story of resilience, of bouncing back from war and tragedy and embracing new ideas and values.
But it's also a cautionary tale, reminding us that even the most well-intentioned ideals can have unforeseen consequences, and that pursuing freedom and tolerance requires us to be constantly vigilant to engage in these difficult conversations.
Amsterdam's journey is a reflection of the complexities we face today. It asks us to think about how we can balance individual liberty with social responsibility. How do we create a society that's both tolerant and just? Those are questions every city, every nation, every person has to grapple with as we navigate the 21st century.
It's a story of hope, in a way, reminding us that even when faced with incredible challenges, people can grow, change, and move forward. And that's a message worth holding on to. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Amsterdam's transformation. Until next time.